Hi, welcome to Art New York. My name is Nikki Maggio. My pronouns are and they, them. And a visual description of myself is I am a white trans person. I have brownish blackish hair tied up in a bun right now. Usually it is medium length. I'm wearing a black dress with some gold chain necklace, and behind me are some white walls. Before we begin our workshop today, we would like to offer a land acknowledgement. I would like to take this time to acknowledge that wherever we're currently located on Turtle Island, otherwise known as North America, we're an occupied territory. Art New York's membership in the 5 boroughs of New York City operates on the unceded ancestral land of the Lenape, Wappinger, Canarsie, Rockaway, and Matinecock communities. I want to honor and celebrate all of these Indigenous communities, their elders past and present, as well as future generations. I also want to take this time to acknowledge that after there was stolen land, there were stolen people. I want to honor the generations of displaced and enslaved people that built and continue to build the country we occupy today. Since we're gathered today in virtual space, let's also take a moment to consider the legacies of colonization embedded within technology, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We're using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many Indigenous communities. Even the technologies that are central to much of the art we make leave significant carbon footprints, contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples worldwide. I invite you to join me in acknowledging all of this, as well as our shared responsibility to make good of this time, and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, anti-racism, and allyship. The virtual part of that land acknowledgement was written by Adrian Wong of Spiderweb Show in Ontario, Canada. To learn more about whose land you are, visit native-land.ca. Thank you and enjoy your workshop.
Conscientious Closing, a conversation with SITI Company administration. This slide features a blue background, the red Art New York logo on the left, and SITI Company's yellow, red, and blue circular logo, inside of which are the headshots of Michelle Preston and Megan E. Carter.
Hi, my name's Megan Carter. I am SITI Company's producing director. My pronouns are she, her. I am a blonde white woman wearing red glasses, sitting in front of a bookshelf.
And I'm Michelle Preston. I'm SITI Company's executive director. I am a brunette, short-haired white woman in a blue shirt, and over my shoulder here is a plant. I'm sitting in my living room.
SITI is an ensemble-based theater company founded in 1992 by Anne Bogart, Tadashi Suzuki, and a group of like-minded artists to redefine and revitalize contemporary American theater with an emphasis on collaboration. We do that through the creation of new theatrical works, training the next generation of theater artists, and through international cultural exchange.
Black and white photo of SITI Company members.
Photo of SITI Company members in the latest production of The Medium.
White text reads, committed to redefining contemporary theater through deep collaboration and international cultural exchange.
So in 2016, as we were heading into our 25th anniversary season, we began a multi-year strategic planning process aimed at determining our trajectory beyond that and adapting to the changing and honestly harsher touring and funding landscapes. So we were trying to figure out how we could adapt as an organization to all of the external forces that we were seeing. As part of that process, we looked at a wide range of growth scenarios, from a merger, from leaving New York City to a community that would be a little bit more financially stable for artists to live in long term, to making the case to launch a capital campaign and buy a building in New York like so many other theaters do. But through this process, with the board and the company and the staff, it became really clear that the ensemble, they didn't want a building. They didn't want to be an institution with a capital I. They didn't want immortality in that way, which is very much not what we're taught we're supposed to want in the nonprofit theater, right? We're supposed to grow. We're supposed to eventually be grown up enough to have a big building. This is the trajectory that you're supposed to be on. And it was through a lot of deep thinking that this group realized that that's actually not what it was about for them. Rather, what we learned is that SITI Company is about this group of founding artists working together, and it couldn't go on in perpetuity because they couldn't go on forever.
So in 2019, we made the decision to sunset, or rather they made the decision to sunset, and I was hired to produce a celebratory finale season and work with Michelle to create a legacy plan. Obviously, the pandemic altered some of our original plans, but we are in the process of creating a highly accessible physical and digital archive for future generations of artists and ensembles. Our finale season kicked off with a hybrid production of Three Sisters at Singapore International Festival of the Arts in 2021. We remounted our seminal devised work from 1993, The Medium, at City Theater in Pittsburgh before touring it throughout the US, and in NYC at BAM. And this fall, we have our Radio Macbeth at NYU Skirball, War of the Worlds, the radio play at the West Bank Cafe, and in December, we're premiering A Christmas Carol at Fisher Center at Bard College. At the end of December 2022, the entity of SITI Company will transition to being a much smaller service organization that will provide access to the archive that I mentioned, access for SITI alumni to connect to each other and to SITI Company artists, and access for anybody to access SITI artists who will continue to share the Suzuki and Viewpoints training.
So let's talk for a little bit about the strategic planning process and some of what we were looking at in that moment, because certainly the obstacles that we were considering are not unique to us. Some are, but not all of them. So one of the biggest pieces we were wrestling with was changes in touring and funding landscape. So SITI Company is a company that tours, so we tend to get engagement fees from presenters around the country. We depend on commissions and residencies to be able to build new work because we don't have our own physical theater space that we sell tickets to in New York City. So we were seeing a lot of changes at the presenter level in that there was less money for residencies and commissions. They had less money for fees. As a company, because we're an actors equity company, we kept getting more expensive. And so those conversations were becoming difficult with fewer and fewer presenters having the money we needed to build a new show. Simultaneously, foundation funders were changing their priorities. They were looking at diversity and inclusion, social justice initiatives, inventive organizational design, collaboration, collectivism, resource sharing. And so we were trying to figure out how our programs and our model of operating aligned with all of these changes.
Photo from Falling and Loving in the background. The text says, the strategic obstacles, changes in touring and funding landscapes, balance of performance education programs, transition planning for ensemble members.
We were also considering the balance of education and touring revenues and where our programmatic focus was. So when SITI Company was founded, they predominantly spent their time making new work, training together, and touring all around the world. And then when they were home in New York, they would carve out periods of time to do New York City training studios and invite other artists to work with them. That became a major education program and a revenue driver eventually. And by 2013, when we launched the SITI Conservatory, the balance between those things really drastically shifted because suddenly we were spending over half the year in New York City with a significant training program, which didn't have as much time in our calendar for company members to go on tour and to build new work. So we were trying to figure out what was the balance that we wanted to be 25 years in, because it was very different from what we started. Color photo of artists training with SITI Company in Los Angeles.
White text reads, SITI's 3 core programs are creating new theatrical works, training the next generation of theater artists, and international cultural exchange.
Another key obstacle and focus that we were looking at was transition planning for all of the ensemble members. So it's important to remember that SITI Company members came together when they were mid-career. Many of them had careers in the regional theater before that. So right now we're looking at an average age of the ensemble that's around 58. And we have a few ensemble members who are in their late 60s, early 70s. So we were figuring out how to create a transition plan for each member when they were ready to sort of move on to a next thing or a next endeavor. So the strategic plan was focused on these elements. First, stabilizing our financial operations and investing resources in new programs that would eventually generate revenue. So that connects to what we were seeing with touring and presenters, what we were seeing with our education revenue balance, what we were seeing from funders. It also prioritized the care of the health and well-being and growth of the company and the staff. So that's work weeks, that's health weeks, but that's also making sure that ensemble members could take on new projects that stretch them artistically, and that staff members had a professional development component and trajectory as well. We were trying to be very holistic in how we were looking at each person's growth. We were working to determine a new long-range artistic vision and trajectory for the organization. We were finding ways to capitalize on existing strengths and resources as we evaluated programs and organizational capacity. And I'm sure that we all have been in rooms where our dreams and our goals are far outstrip our organizational capacity. So we were looking at where did we need to build capacity? How long would it take us to do that? What programs could we implement now? What needed to wait? And we were also looking at ways that we as an organization could start implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives for ourselves. The ensemble was predominantly white, as was the staff and the board. And so we were really looking at ways that we could change that makeup organically and with buy-in from company and board. Black slide with white text outlining the strategic planning process.
In 2017, Citi began a new strategic planning process focused on stabilizing financial operations of the organization, taking care of the health, well-being, and growth of the company and staff, determining a long-range artistic vision and trajectory for the organization, capitalizing on existing strengths and resources as we evaluate programs and organizational capacity, implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives.
So here are some of the scenarios that we looked at before considering sunset as a viable option, because sunset was not the first thing that was on the table.
Photo of Will Bond in chess match, looking at a chess set, outlining the strategic scenarios from the 2016 strategic planning.
White text reads the scenarios: merger, university partner for training, relocation, capital campaign.
We looked at before considering sunset as a viable option, because sunset was not the first thing that was on the table. So one of the big ideas that we had was whether or not we could merge with another theater company or a couple of theater companies that also had a pedagogy or a key educational component. And together, could we make a larger organization? Think of it like an American theater for ensemble training, which was a very exciting idea. We also returned to an old idea, which was, could we find a university partner for our training program? So could we move that conservatory and the ensemble members who were the predominant faculty for that into a larger education institution in a way that supported them financially in a different way and allowed the artist training with us access to degrees and loans and things that they didn't have through us. We considered relocating and moving out of New York. Yes, we did start in Saratoga Springs as a place to have an artistic retreat. And we looked at other communities upstate because New York City was becoming a very expensive, very hard city to continue to live in, which is still true. And because we had to do it, because everyone tries to look at it, could we do a capital campaign? Did we have a donor base for that? What would be the case behind us having our own building? We did deeply explore that.
So there was a lot of process around this. And something that's important to know is that despite the outside world's view that Anne Bogart calls all the shots in SITI Company, This company has always been consensus-based. Conversations around decision-making happen in formal company meetings, in board meetings. They happen through informal routes. But any big decision about the direction of the organization, anything that affects the artists, is brought to the group.
Photo of City Company members in Who Do You Think You Are? Bullets describing the process of consensus overlaid on top.
Consensus, determining what the company didn't want for the future. Multiple meetings and voting on the scenarios. Deciding together how to end the company with intentionality.
That means that time has to be built into every process because there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of reframing, a lot of lateral thinking. So this strategic planning process that Michelle has been talking about was happening on several levels, including the company level. There were years of conversation about impact, the pros and cons. And as the company started circling around the idea of a sunset, it was obviously an incredibly emotional process. City Company is a life's work. There were several blind straw poll votes, non-binding, just to read the group of ensemble members and the board. At various points, members abstained or preferred to support the wisdom of the group rather than heavily support one plan or another. Eventually, we arrived at a place where everyone felt strongly one way or another, and we took a final anonymous vote, a binding vote. And ensemble all agreed that the majority opinion would reign. So that's how we came to consensus about sunsetting, which was supported by the board.
And it's really important to remember years. This conversation took years. And the ensemble, the board, we went through all of those other scenarios, and we would get excited about one, and then we would explore it for a while, and then we would realize that there were too many challenges or it didn't really fit what we wanted. It was a huge, huge process. But this sunsetting idea was something that we kept coming back to. And that, as I've read through many years of strategic plans before me, was always talked about as something that was an option for the group. Like they never really seemed to believe in perpetuity as a group.
Definitely. So even though the decision to end was difficult, ultimately what we wanted to do is to celebrate 30 years of achievement and City Company's tremendous impact on the field, to not go softly into the night, but to go out with a bang.
So there are a couple key components to the legacy plan, which is what we ended up calling outwardly what we were doing. It was the City Company legacy plan, and it had a fundraising campaign behind it. And the key elements were a 30th anniversary finale season, which in our minds spanned multiple years. Significant final training activities. So having a big return to our annual residency at Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, every summer, like that was going to be a huge blowout final Skidmore. We were, really envisioning significant New York City trainings, the workshops and residencies that we do all over the world and the country, making sure that there was a robust slate of those in the last couple of years as well. Building the City Living Archive, which would be both digital and physical, and finding a partner for that is key so that people can continue to access what City built, how they built it, who they are, well beyond sort of the end date of the current configuration. We wanted to make sure that company members were able to transition easily to their next step. And that came about in a couple of different forms, but one of the biggest is grants to the company members at the end of 2022 to help them financially ease into the next thing. And then field-wide learning. So conversations like this one, conversations like the plenary at the TCG conference in 2022 that the company spoke at, creating a public legacy document that will be available on our website in 2023, publishing a city book, all of the different ways that our decision and the process in which we made that could be really useful for others in the field who are looking for a model even if they don't ultimately do it the same way or make the same decision.
Photo from Going, Going, Gone, and an outline of the legacy plan.
Text reads, 30th anniversary finale season, significant training activities, City Living Archive, company member transitions, and field-wide learning.
So messaging became a really important thing and was actually my first task when I came on in 2019. So we started creating talking points because, again, this is not something that happens a lot. There weren't a lot of models for us to look at. And of course, our situation is unique. So we started creating talking points and messaging, which we revised when we realized that we were going to have to announce our big news in the middle of a pandemic. Further difficulties came from the fact that City has never been easy to sum up. They sort of resist sound bites. Everything leans towards complexity. So language and precision of language was crucial. We also had to keep things moving through grief. And there was a tricky balance between empathy and action. Again, as I said earlier, this is the life's work of these artists, and the decision to sunset was incredibly courageous, and terrifying and hard, though ultimately the right thing to do, and ultimately the way to end on their own terms. But it did mean that Michelle and I, leading through this process, really had to dig deep in terms of empathy and also keep things moving forward, which is so much harder than you think it is.
And in many ways, Megan and I don't believe one person could have held all of that and kept moving forward. So the partnership between Megan and I to be able to do that was really important because we kind of had to tag team. Like there were days where she was the one who held all of the empathy and I was like, okay, and this contract and here we move forward. And then other days where it was my turn to sort of hold the empathy, and Megan had to push things forward. And then we had to make space for our own grief as leaders in this organization and as people who care deeply about City Company, the ensemble, and City Company, the people, and City Company, the organization, and all of the concentric circles of alumni and friends that surround that. And we did all of that in a pandemic. Like, let's not gloss over that. I mean, we were already pitching the legacy plan to funders and to presenters in fall of 2019 and at APAP in 2020. So January, February of 2020. We were pitching what we thought at the time was almost 8 shows worth of activity. Some of them were brand new. Some of them were older works that were remounted. Some of them were works that people loved, and we just knew we had to keep touring. And, you know, like everyone else, in early 2020, spring 2020, we just waited to see what was going to get canceled in that season or postponed. And it sort of put a damper on a number of the productions that we thought we were going to do. Although at the end of the day, I am really proud and I do really support the productions that we did incorporate into the finale season.
As am I, though. There are definitely some that I wish we'd been able to do. Stupid pandemic. We did have a lucky ace up our sleeve, though, which was the archive. So the archive was always part of the legacy plan, but it was not the first thing that we were thinking about in 2020. But then the pandemic happened and it suddenly became a lifeline. So we front loaded the archive work using the company members and paying them as content specialists while we couldn't perform. We also started working on the City Company book, which the company had been talking about for many years and never had time to do or sort of pull together. So we began that process as well. We applied for special funding to get an archive assessment done quickly and put company members to work in the summer of 2020.
Yeah, and I think big shout out to both the Howard Gilman Foundation, who was the first funder of the Legacy Plan. That was one of the first conversations we had, as well as the Mellon Foundation, who really jumped in quickly to get that archive assessment started for us. And we've had some great funders come in later through the process to fund the archive, but those were the two who really in 2020 made sure that this was going to happen. Photo from Three Sisters in collaboration with 9 Years Theater. Gray text box overlaid on top of the photo outlining ways that we pivoted in the pandemic.
Text reads, archive work to the forefront, online talks and training, hybrid production, and loading entire finale season at the very end.
You know, another big pivot in the pandemic, and something we had never really considered before, is how to move the training, the Suzuki and the viewpoints, online, virtually. So the first PPP loan that we got was a huge lifesaver. And so we created 8 weeks of virtual rehearsal contracts for the ensemble. It kept our artists employed, earning health weeks, and it allowed them to be together during a really dark time. So that was May and June of 2020. And part of this was a test to see if SITI Company could do Suzuki and viewpoints online with each other, because if that failed, then there was no point in exploring virtual training. But what they found out is that they could do it. It was maybe they didn't love it as much as being in the room, but it was possible. And in fact, some interesting things happened. So the 2020 Skidmore program, our annual summer residency, was of course canceled, but we did host what we called Skidmore Day One. It was a free event in place of what would have been that training. And for all of our alumni, and over 100 people came and trained that day with the company, and then had a big conversation afterwards, which is really exciting. And it reminded us that we have a global community of artists and alumni who have worked with us. And in fact, if we don't make them fly to a certain place to be in the room with us, they can come digitally be in the room with us. And that was really exciting. And I certainly felt like we should have thought of it sooner, well, before the pandemic forced us to do it. But we have been able to continue to offer virtual training through 2022 as a way to keep our global alumni engaged, which is really exciting. Also, because we knew that we were shooting to end at the end of 2022, we had significant accumulated cash reserves. We were able to think about how to spend that in a different way than our peers were in the pandemic. We were able to prioritize people over operating expenses or people over a building, which is a very privileged position, I have to say, that I was in, to be able to make decisions from that place. But knowing that we didn't have to keep those reserves around for 10 years was key to that.
The company also got really creative. For, I would say, a very analog company, we adjusted rather quickly to virtual reality. Michelle's talked about the training, but we also made a film very early in the pandemic. Darren West and Ellen Morin adapted the solo show Room of SITI Companies about Virginia Woolf into a beautiful little film. And then we were supposed to take Three Sisters to the Singapore International Festival of the Arts in 2020. It was postponed to 2021. We really thought we were going to be able to do it in 2021. But at the last minute, we realized that we were not all going to be able to go to Singapore because of the pandemic. And so we created a hybrid production with SITI Company members filming themselves in West Fulton, New York, and then sending all of that film over to our collaborators in Singapore, 9 Years Theater Company. And so they did the show live with SITI Company filmed. It was a thing, it happened.
It was beautiful. And we would have never explored it if we didn't have to in that way. Absolutely.
I mean, we're still sad that we didn't get to be in the room with our Singaporean collaborators, but it was a great moment in terms of the company's ingenuity and innovation. So pushing the finale season to the end of everything has created a very high stakes producing situation for us. You know, we lost so many shows that we were planning to do. Michelle and I joke that we had plan A through plan W. I think at this point we actually have gone to plan Z. We were in Pittsburgh at the height of Omicron. Fall tours and New York City seasons, as so many pandemic restrictions, you know, lifted, but subvariants were happening, and like it just was like the ground was constantly shifting, and it still is, as we have our last 3 months and 4 shows that we're doing.
Yeah, and it becomes such an emotional thing every show. Every time we close out a production, it's the last time that production's going to happen for these artists. And so there's so much emotion. And so every time we went into a tour or a residency, the idea that we were going to lose a couple of shows because of a, you know, positive COVID test or something, it just felt like so high stakes because we didn't get them back. We can't reschedule for next year. That's not on the table for this company in this season. So it was a lot of stress that Megan and I and the staff and the artists honestly carried. They were so careful with each other, and being masked and doing all the things that they needed to do to protect the show because they all knew how important it was too.
They've been living like monks. Yeah.
It was high stakes in the truest sense of the word for everybody on the team.
It also, for me, really highlighted the beauty of the ensemble, their ability to take care of each other, their deep sense of other people, became key. And, you know, being an ensemble in the United States of America is beautiful and impossible. It requires a tenacity from the artists that's beyond the usual tenacity that artists have to have in this country. You know, renewing commitment in the belief that sustained collaboration has value. That's constantly SITI Company has had to recommit to that idea over 30 years. You know, the way funding works in the United States makes art very difficult. It makes an ensemble even more difficult.
Photo of Bob Rauschenberg America with text overlaid, a quote from Mark Masterson, current co-artistic director of City Theater, former artistic director of Actors Theater of Louisville. They have demonstrated to themselves and to the world how deeply difficult and profoundly rewarding it is to be an ensemble, and they have made a body of work that is passionately distinctive. One of the things that we get a lot of questions about in terms of the legacy plan is how did we get it funded? What were those conversations like, especially in a world where, as Megan's saying, like supporting an ensemble, the way we prioritize people over things is a hard sell sometimes for funders who like to fund buildings and things and theaters. And we're glad that they do that. Please keep doing that.
But we're all about the people. You know, and so much of City's 30 years has been about survival mode rather than strategic mode. And that a lot of that's baked into the culture of the company. But I do think it's the thing that allowed us to pivot during the pandemic. I think it's the thing that allowed City to go on for 30 years, that they were constantly reinventing themselves. And I think this is part of what's interesting to the field at this point. Looking back, there are lessons for new ensembles. And one of the things that I am extremely proud of, and that will go public very, very soon, is the digital archive. In addition to the physical archive, the digital archive will be highly accessible. It's filled with things, programs, photos, video clips. It's an extraordinary resource for future ensembles. And the SITI Company book, which will be published in November, which is a looking back, and it's full of anecdotes and life lessons and lessons about craft. And it's really the story of a group of artists working together over 30 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Photo and background of Ellen Lauren in room, facing upstage. And a quote from Tom Hewitt, Broadway actor who's worked with SITI Company. I can think of no rehearsal process in the past several years where someone hasn't referenced the SITI Company. Rare is the heated late night conversation among actors that doesn't cite a SITI production, actor, or workshop. The aesthetics of the company are now part of the theatrical vernacular. Their playful, courageous, and intelligent work has transformed the American theater.
Absolutely. And it was really important to us as we were having conversations about why are there two versions of the archive and what do we want it to do, was to make sure that the digital archive, which citi.org will retain control of, was not gated. Academic institutions put a lot of money behind taking care of archives, and we're incredibly thankful for that. And there will be a physical archive and a partner to do that. But then it becomes a more gated system. It gets harder to access internationally. It gets harder to access without being there. It's harder to access without permission. And so creating a version of the archive that didn't have that gated sense to it was really important. We also, back to sort of the idea of who funded this and why, and what were those conversations like? We really, we were very transparent with a lot of the funders that had supported us for many years as to why we were doing this long before we announced. And part of the conversation was to encourage significant gifts in these years. And then we actually weren't going to ask them for money anymore. We hope that that money would then be repurposed to other people in our community, in our theater ecosystem, so that, funders who were changing priorities could really think about where, this pot of money, which had consistently gone to SITI Company for 20 years, could then go to new organizations or younger organizations. So we were very transparent about that. And then we were able to access funds through New York Community Trust, through the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation for aspects of the legacy plan that we had never been able to directly access before. And so that was really exciting. And so I'm really proud of all of the funders who came on to support this really ambitious project and this really important conversation for the field.
In conclusion, Michelle and I are currently in the middle of opening two of our finale shows. We have a gala next week, and I think neither one of us can actually imagine the end that's coming. So I suspect we'll have more to say after we've had a minute in 2023.
Yeah, and I think that, we hope to have a very exciting follow-up conversation, because the nonprofit entity that is SITI Company is not going to be dissolved. It will continue to exist. It will just be much smaller than the $1.3 million organization that we are currently. And so it will continue to serve the ensemble members, but also the field and our alumni in really interesting ways. And so my hope is that we will come back and have another conversation about what that looks like with the new managing director of that organization going forward. Photo of Kelly Maurer in the Suzuki training with students at Skidmore College. Quote from Ben Cameron overlaid in text. They have inspired an entire generation of young artists, not to imitate them, but to find their own way, to ask their own questions, to stay eternally dissatisfied in the quest for always asking more.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. White slide, black text outlining the photo credits of all of the photos in this slideshow.
Cabin Pressure, 1999, Richard C. Trigg. The Medium, 2022, Stephen Molina Contreras. LA Workshop, 2021, Patrick Mullery. Falling and Loving, 2019, Marina Levitskaya. Chess Match Number 5, 2017, Maria Baranova. Who Do You Think You Are, 2008, Michael Brosnow. Going, Going, Gone, 1996, Richard C. Trigg. Three Sisters with 9 Years Theater, 2021, The Pond Photography. Room, 2011, Chasney Annexi. Bob Rauschenberg America, 2002, Michael Brosnelal. And Training at Skidmore College, Michelle Preston.
Thank you.
Thank you, Art New York, for allowing us to do this and share with the membership.